So to begin, it's my pleasure to introduce Nathalie Molina Niño, who's the CEO of O to the Third Power, which appropriately stands for Outcomes Over Optics. Nathalie is also an investor and author, and she will discuss entrepreneurship and support for immigrant-owned businesses. Nathalie, thank you so much. Over to you.
Thank you for that kind introduction and for your flexibility today with the schedule as well. My distinguished fellow panelists will be talking about such important topics that are really near and dear to my heart, from credit unions to housing and healthcare. And I want to open by saying that oftentimes business ownership is relegated to almost this idea of the higher levels in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? It's something that I think we sometimes think comes after an individual's basic needs are met. We've got to make sure that people first have a roof over their heads, that they have food to eat. Healthcare, of course, comes amidst all of that. And then after all of that, we think about how we as a society can move people into the economic class that can own a home, maybe have a savings account, start a little business, and maybe create jobs for others, and someday, perhaps, even 1-2 generations later, set their sights on this idea of a growing business, maybe even a business with a global footprint. And that's very much the sort of linear, incremental, maybe even traditional version of economic mobility and progress. But thankfully, in my experience, and it sounds like the experience of many of those at the event today, immigrants don't care about linear progress or incrementalism. I wrote a book titled Leapfrog, and in the book I talk about remembering seeing farmers in the Ecuadorian Andes, where half of my family is from, who had never had a landline in their homes, but now they're suddenly walking around with 2 smartphones in their pockets. That is the definition of a leapfrog, and it's what we aspire to in the world of tech. And when immigrants come here, that aspiration to leapfrog, it doesn't change, and it certainly doesn't go away. In fact, there's a study by the National Foundation for American Policy that came out last year that found that immigrants have founded 55% of the billion-dollar startups in the United States. So immigrants, it would appear, disagree with Maslow, and they think that business ownership really, in the context where they can control their own destinies, is about as important as the air that we breathe and the food that we eat, which really makes sense, especially if you come from places where the infrastructure and the national safety nets have been breached or they just can't be trusted, which, I'll be honest, is what makes 2020 so incredibly devastating. Because when over 90% of Black and Latinx small business owners were excluded by design from hundreds of billions of dollars in federal stimulus, it's nothing short of devastating to think how many immigrants are impacted. Immigrants in my community, the Latinx community, have become the fastest growing small business owners across the United States. According to, in fact, a recent study by Stanford, over the past 10 years, the number of Latinx business owners grew 34%, compared to 1% for all business owners broadly. But it's not just the Latinx community. In the last month, as my team and I scrambled to push through hundreds of federal PPP loans, frankly cashing in on every favor from every bank executive that I have ever met in my entire life, I met an immigrant from Sierra Leone, and her name is Mariama. And Mariama, she survived a civil war before coming to the United States, and then becoming a nurse practitioner and ultimately co-founding her healthcare business, Suma Home Care, which is located just outside of Philly. Mariama is the quintessential leapfrogger. And thanks to our federal government stimulus failure, which is the only thing that I can think of calling it, Mariama's business, with 150 employees that provides critical medical services to her predominantly Black community, was nearly lost. As Mariama recently told Poppy Harlow in a CNN interview, TD Bank inexplicably rejected her PPP loan, and in desperation, she went looking for alternatives. And when she finally found my team and I, we were able to connect her to Live Oak Bank out of DC, who ultimately secured a loan. That means Mariama, her employees, and the patients that they care for will get a fighting chance of survival. Not a guarantee, but a chance. You see, Mariama is a perfect example because it shows that the immigrant experience doesn't finish with an entrepreneurial happy ending. It actually starts with entrepreneurship. It grows with entrepreneurship. And yes, sometimes it ends with a wonderful story of entrepreneurial success. And I'm one of those. I'm here because my scrappy entrepreneurial dad worked tirelessly in the sweatshops of Los Angeles, so I could go to a fancy prep school in Hollywood Hills and ultimately even fancier colleges. And I'm here because my mom took a union job so that no matter what my dad was up to, we always had health insurance and basic protection, which is why really my ask and my contribution today is for all of us, whether we are investing from our piggy banks or we are professional investors or people with influences into everything from pension plans to endowments. I would ask us to invest in anything and everything that protects and helps small businesses survive and thrive. And I would also say that despite the popularity of TV shows like Shark Tank and the apparent ubiquity of venture capital, let me remind you that venture capital touches 0.05% of all businesses in this country. 0.05%. I love repeating that number because nobody ever believes me. Venture capital takes up 99% of the oxygen and seemingly 99% of the press, but what most businesses really need is good loans, lines of credit, even equity crowdfunding and other forms of innovative financing. So I would say, let's turn off the TV. Shark Tank is fun, but it's a TV show. Let's stop letting the venture capitalists take all the oxygen and focus our efforts on the businesses that matter most. Because I cannot think of anything more important than the small and growing Main Street businesses of our nation's immigrants. Thank you so much for having me.